The auction yard was nothing more than a patch of trampled dirt at the edge of town, ringed with wagons, posts, and the stink of dust, sweat, and horse dung. Men leaned on rails with whiskey on their breath, spitting tobacco juice into the ground as the auctioneer barked and hollered, his voice rising over the restless crowd. Livestock had gone first, mules, a few scrawny cows, even a wagon wheel or two. Then came the human lots, a cruel business whispered about but never hidden, for out here on the frontier, dignity was just another thing that could be bought and sold. When they brought her out, the air shifted. A thin Apache woman, her dress torn, her cheek swollen and dark from a fresh bruise. She walked stiffly, her bare feet dragging across the dirt, and when the auctioneer shoved her forward onto the block, she stumbled but did not cry out. Her wrists were bound, the rope cutting into her skin, and her long black hair hung in tangles across her face. For a moment, the crowd went quiet, not out of pity, but out of contempt. $2, gentlemen, the auctioneer jeered, his hand waving lazily in the air. $2 for the savage girl. Barely good for work, but she'll scrub, she'll haul, she'll do as told. Who's got $1.50? Who's got $2? The silence that followed was louder than any shout. Men shook their heads, smirking, and a few laughed outright. Not worth the rope on her hands, someone muttered. Another spat in the dirt and said, I'd pay $2 to see her gone. The woman stood motionless through the insults, her dark eyes fixed somewhere far away, as if her spirit had already drifted beyond the circle of jeering men. It was then that the cowboy stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. He had been leaning against a post, hat pulled low, dust from the long trail still clinging to his coat. His face was weathered but steady, and his eyes, though tired, carried something the others lacked, an unwillingness to look away. He took a slow step forward, the wooden boards of the platform creaking under his boot. I'll pay the $2, he said, his voice low but clear. The crowd turned, a ripple of disbelief running through them. A few men laughed, one slapped his knee and barked, that fool's got pity to burn. The auctioneer blinked, then smirked, slamming the gavel down. Sold for $2. A bargain, gentlemen. The cowboy didn't look at them. He walked up, placed 2 silver coins into the auctioneer's greedy hand, and then, with deliberate gentleness, untied the rope from the woman's wrists. She flinched at his touch, but he didn't push her. Instead, he simply said, "Come on," and guided her down the steps, steadying her when her legs threatened to give way. As he helped her toward his horse waiting just beyond the crowd, the jeers and whispers followed. "A lonely man's charity," one voice sneered. "Or his curse," another added. But the cowboy didn't answer, didn't look back. He lifted her carefully into the saddle, swung up behind her, and with a quiet flick of the reins, rode out of the circle of mocking men. Behind them, the laughter faded into the dust. Ahead lay nothing certain, only the wide, merciless prairie. But for the first time in what felt like years, the cowboy's chest carried something other than emptiness. The road out of town was little more than a track cut into the prairie, the dust rising in slow clouds beneath the hooves of his horse. The cowboy kept the reins loose, his broad shoulders shifting with the rhythm of the animal's gait, his hat low against the setting sun. In front of him, the Apache woman sat stiffly in the saddle, her body tense as a bowstring. She hadn't spoken a word since leaving the auction yard, hadn't looked at him either, only stared straight ahead with hollow eyes that seemed fixed on some horizon far beyond the open land. The cowboy didn't press her. He knew silence, he had lived in it for years. His ranch, miles from town, was full of it. Long days of mending fences, quiet suppers by the fire, the sound of wind howling against the eaves. Loneliness was something he had come to wear like a second skin. And now, as he glanced at her bruised cheek and the rope-burned wrists folded tight in her lap, he thought of how silence could mean survival for some. She had been stripped of everything, even her right to speak. He wasn't about to take that from her too. By the time they reached the bend where the cottonwoods grew along the creek, the woman swayed slightly in the saddle. He steadied her with one arm, murmuring low, "Easy now. We'll stop a bit." He guided the horse down toward the water, the prairie grass brushing against their boots as they descended. When the horse came to a halt, he swung down and then reached up to help her dismount. She hesitated, but her legs trembled too much to argue. With care, he lifted her down, his hands firm but gentle, and set her on her feet. She staggered, leaning against the trunk of a cottonwood, her breaths coming quick and shallow. He untied his canteen, crouched by the creek to fill it, and brought it to her. She stared at it for a long moment before taking it, her fingers brushing his. She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin, and when she stopped, he noticed her hands trembling. He wanted to say something, assure her that she was safe now, but the words felt clumsy in his throat. Instead, he busied himself with starting a small fire, collecting dry brush from the bank and striking a spark into life. The crackle of flames filled the silence between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost uncertain. "You don't owe me anything. Not a thing." He poked at the fire, the sparks rising into the dusk. "I didn't buy you to keep you. Not like that. I couldn't stand there, watch them mock you like you were nothing." She turned her face toward him then, her dark eyes narrowing as if trying to gauge his truth. He met her gaze steady, his jaw set, though the firelight made his expression softer than he intended. After a long pause, she whispered the first words he'd heard from her lips, "Why?" The cowboy leaned back against the tree trunk, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Because no one deserves to be left behind like that. You've had enough taken from you. From here on, you're not a slave." The road out of town was nothing more than a track of rutted earth, its edges lined with tumbleweed and the silhouettes of mesquite trees. The cowboy kept his horse at a steady pace, the saddle creaking softly under their combined weight. The Apache woman sat stiffly in front of him, her hands folded in her lap, her shoulders rigid as if bracing for a blow that hadn't yet come. Every few steps, the animal's hooves sent up little puffs of dust that swirled in the fading light, the sounds of the jeering crowd behind them fading into silence. He didn't speak right away. He knew better than to fill the air with words just for the sake of them. Instead, he kept his eyes on the horizon, the wide sweep of the prairie stretching out before them in tones of gold and purple under the setting sun. The land itself seemed to breathe more freely once they left the town behind. After a while, he adjusted the reins with one hand and pulled a small canteen from his saddle bag with the other. He held it out to her. "Water," he said simply. She hesitated, her eyes flicking toward him, wary, then toward the canteen. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she took it. She raised it to her lips, sipped carefully, then handed it back without a word. Her movements were deliberate, as though she expected the offer to be snatched back at any moment. The cowboy nodded once, as if to say that was enough. They rode on in silence until the lights of the town had disappeared behind them. Then, in the quiet of the open land, he spoke again, his voice calm, steady. "I didn't buy you to own you," he said. "I bought you because I couldn't stomach the thought of them leaving you there." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Out here, nobody should be left alone like that. Not man, not woman." For the first time, she turned her head slightly, not enough to meet his eyes, but enough to show she had heard him. Her lips parted, as though she might speak, but no sound came. She looked away again, back at the endless horizon. He didn't press her. Trust was not a thing that could be demanded, it had to be grown, slow as grass pushing through stone. By the time they reached his small ranch, night had fallen. The barn loomed dark against the starlit sky, and the warm glow of a single lantern shone faintly through the window of his cabin. He dismounted first, steadying her as she slid down from the saddle. She wavered on her feet, unused to the support, but he didn't let her fall. He led her toward the cabin, his hand never tightening, never forcing, only guiding. Inside, the room was plain, a wood stove, a table, a narrow bed, and shelves lined with the practical things of a man who lived alone. He gestured to the chair by the table. "Sit," he said. She lowered herself slowly, her eyes scanning the room as though mapping every detail for escape. He set about stoking the stove, the firelight flickering to life and chasing away the chill. When he turned back, he met her gaze, dark, guarded, but not empty. "You're not my property," he said quietly, as if needing her to understand before the night passed. "From this day on, you're family. Whatever that means to you." She blinked, her lips pressing together tightly. No tears, no words, just silence. But her shoulders eased, just slightly, as though for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to rest. The cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the fire in the stove, the soft hiss of burning wood filling the air with warmth. The Apache woman sat in the chair he had offered, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her shoulders hunched as if she still expected a lash or a command to fall at any moment. The cowboy crouched by his trunk, pulling out a worn leather satchel. He set it on the table, the contents rattling faintly, a small bottle of whiskey, rolls of bandage, a needle, thread, and a tin of salve he'd traded for months back. He set them down gently, careful not to make any sudden moves. Best to see to those cuts before they fester, he said softly. His voice was calm, practical, the same tone he might use on a wounded colt. She glanced at the supplies, then back at him, suspicion flickering in her eyes. When he stepped closer, she drew back, her body tightening like a cornered animal. He froze, hands raised slightly, showing he meant no harm. You don't have to let me, he said. But infection'll take worse from you than I ever could. Her jaw worked as though she wanted to argue, but no words came. Slowly, after a long moment, she extended her wrist toward him. The skin was raw, rope burned deep into the flesh, scabbed and angry. He took her arm carefully, as though holding something fragile that might break. With a cloth dipped in whiskey, he dabbed at the wound. She hissed, flinching, but he kept his touch steady, murmuring low, I know it burns. Just a bit more. One by one, he cleaned the bruises on her cheek, the split at her lip, the scrape along her arm. She never stopped watching him, her dark eyes tracking his every move as though waiting for the moment when his gentleness might twist into cruelty. But it didn't. His hands were rough, calloused from ranch work, yet every motion was careful, respectful. He never touched more than he needed to, never lingered. When he reached for the torn fabric of her sleeve to inspect her shoulder, she jerked back sharply, shaking her head. Her breath came fast, panic flashing across her face. He immediately leaned back, lowering his hand. All right, he said softly. We'll stop there. No one's forcing you. He set the cloth aside and leaned against the table, giving her space. For a long time, she sat rigid, staring at him as though waiting for the anger that never came. Then, slowly, she touched the clean bandage he'd wrapped around her wrist. Her fingers traced it, testing its snugness. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable, then whispered one word, her voice hoarse and low, why? The cowboy met her gaze steadily, his tone plain. Because you're hurt, and I can't abide leaving hurt things to rot. He didn't offer more than that, no sermons, no grand speeches. Just the truth, simple and solid, the way he lived his life. Her eyes softened, barely perceptible, but enough for him to notice. She turned her face away, staring into the fire. For the first time since he'd seen her on the auction block, her posture eased. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the first crack in the wall she'd built to survive.